Hey, it's Sam. I'm making this video as a case study on the chart of Edwards Snowden, the NSA leaker, and looking at his chart and the comparison of his chart to the planetary transits and the planets in the sky to show the importance of the planets and how they move, when they move, and how the inner zodiac interacts with the outer zodiac. This is really how astrology works on a very fundamental level. And of course it's actually the basis of a lot of Western astrology. The planetary transits moving through the sky interacting with our inner zodiac. But of course Vedic astrology also adds the power of the dasha cycles, or the timing cycles related to the planets. Now, I don't have Snowden's actual birth time, so I'm not going to be talking about the dashas because I don't really know what his dashas are. But the transits are very telling, and you'll see some remarkable coincidences with the outer and the inner zodiac. And I want you to understand this before I start, that this is a deep framework. Astrology really starts with your framework. Like, what is it? Is it those planets up there doing stuff to us down here, or is it about our co-creative relationship with the universe? The birth chart itself shows the aggregate of all of our past karma and the things we're likely to do in this lifetime, and it shows our inner environment, our inner zodiac. As it says in Bharat Parashara Sastra, it's the zodiac is the Kala Purusha, which is the being in time, and the planets, wherever they are in the zodiac when we were born, that shows our energetic imprint. And as you become a good astrologer, you can read what that means. The outer zodiac, or the planets moving through the sky, when they interact with the planets in the birth chart, then you bring this kind of quality. I did a recent video about the, is it that the planets are doing stuff to us from above, or is it that we are doing it from below? It's actually this co-creative relationship. And so you see this intermingling between our inner psyche and inner chakra environment with the outer chakra zodiac of the sky. So let's get to it. When Edward Snowden was born, actually he was born June 21st, 1983, and of note, and I'm going to focus on a few things here that are the most important, and especially that show the triggering of these karmas. When he was born, Mars and Rahu were 1 to 130 of sidereal Gemini. So his Mars was 1 degree 14 minutes of Gemini, and Rahu was 1 degree 29 minutes of sidereal Gemini when he was born. Very important. A few other important things is Mercury was at 17 degrees of Taurus, so it wasn't that far away. Mercury 17 degrees Taurus, then Mars 1 degree 14 of Gemini, Rahu 1 degree 29 of Gemini, and then the Sun at 6 degrees of Gemini. So he's got these planets bunched up in that little area, particularly when you get into Gemini. Mars 1 degree, Rahu 1 degree, and the Sun 6 degrees. So from 1 to 6 degrees, 3 important planets, and then his Mercury is also in Taurus. The other thing that's very important in his chart is that when he was born, his moon was at 24 degrees Libra, and his Saturn was at 4 degrees Libra. So he's got Saturn, moon in Libra. In particular, that moon at 24 degrees, Vishaka Nakshatra, is also quite important because we're going to see that triggered by quite a few of the transits as well, that moon at about 24 degrees. So when we look at this event, I'm actually looking at 3 different charts. The day of the NSA disclosure, which first the story broke, and then we didn't know who was behind it, who the leaker was. That happened on June 5th, 2013. Then June 9th, 2013, we became aware that it was Snowden. And then I'm also going to focus on, a few weeks ago, around the middle of December 2013, the Supreme Court passed a ruling that that actually said that the NSA leaks and the surveillance program, rather not the leaks, but that the surveillance program was unconstitutional. Now, actually, not long after, another court justice said that it was constitutional. Actually, it wasn't Supreme Court, but it was a federal judge, said on December 16th, said that it was unconstitutional, the NSA surveillance program, and another judge later said that it was constitutional. But this, I'll talk about in a little bit, but these disclosures from in June of 2013 has actually led to worldwide scrutiny of the United States and their surveillance program. 2013 could easily be remembered as a year when the United States government took a lot of beatings around the world for this surveillance program. The prime ministers of Germany and of Brazil and of other countries, of many European countries, and our allies have come out in deep protest to us spying on their leaders and all kinds of stuff. So this was a huge catalyst for the U.S. NSA surveillance program being under scrutiny. So when we look at the chart of June 5th, 2013, it's very important we look at Jupiter. In particular, Jupiter had just gone into sidereal Gemini. Now again, we also have to realize Gemini is a sign of information, of details, of sort of going against tradition and belief, like the culture or the belief or the philosophy of the government, of the NSA. Gemini is like, well, you know, Gemini is a sign that goes against those things, and it's about truth and information and speaking the truth. Jupiter goes into Gemini 1 degree 17 minutes on June 5th, 2013, is an exact conjunction with his natal Mars and his natal Rahu. Couldn't be more exact. So those two planets, that his Mars-Rahu conjunction in Gemini, exact transit from Jupiter in the sky. So Jupiter in the sky goes over the same place in his chart where he's got Mars-Rahu in Gemini. And again, Mars-Rahu, Gemini, which is about destroying the information. Rahu is also about secret stuff, secrets. Again, Gemini is a sign of neutrality. It's really sort of analogous to like a scientist shooting holes in like religious doctrine. But you can also say religious doctrine like in the form of government doctrine, and someone like Snowden who you can't control, because Gemini is flexible, it's dual, and it definitely is, you know, antagonistic to a rigid culture, whether that culture has to do with religious or governmental culture. You see his Mars-Rahu in Gemini destroyed that sacred vow of, you know, silence or of adherence to the philosophy and the culture. So Jupiter going into Gemini, Jupiter is about truth, it's about vision, it's about a higher purpose, a higher meaning. So the evolution of Jupiter isn't to just maintain the company line or the religious line, it's to actually do things that are bigger than just life on Earth. So he really sacrificed himself for a higher cause, which again is very much Jupiter in Gemini as well, in a higher evolved sense. So Jupiter goes into Gemini, goes over his Mars-Rahu, very powerful. In addition, at that time, the Sun was very close to his natal Mercury. Sun and Mars in the sky on June 5th, 2013 also were very close to his natal Mercury. Like I said, his Mercury was in Taurus. Mars and Sun on that day were sandwiching his natal Mercury. Also, Venus had just gone over his natal Sun in the sky. Venus in the sky had gone over his natal Sun. So you can see there's a lot of energy around that Taurus-Gemini axis. Now that was the day that it was disclosed. That was before we knew who it was. The day that we knew it was Edward Snowden, which is the day that he came to prominence. Again, these are different things. So the story breaks. And it's interesting to look at the moon also and compare the moon, because the other planets haven't moved that much, but it's the moon that moves every day. So on June 5th, the moon was joined Ketu in Aries, very close, moon-Ketu conjunction in Aries, when the story broke. And then 4 days later, the moon goes into Gemini and goes over that same place in the sky where he's got all those planets, where I was just talking about. So, you know, around noon that day, the moon was at about 6 degrees Gemini. So the moon, the day that he became known as the person who did it, the moon, the day before the moon went over his natal Mercury, then by the time the next day comes, the moon goes over his natal his natal Mars, his natal Rahu, and his natal Sun. So on June 9th, the moon goes into Gemini, goes over those planets in his chart, his moon, Rahu, Sun conjunction. So again, you have his natal sun and then the transiting moon. So again, this is like a lunation cycle with him. His sun is there, and then the moon in the sky goes there. So it's like a new moon for him, you might say. And again, it's also in the sky that day on June 9th. This moon also passes that Jupiter. It's also joined that Venus and joined that Mercury. So that day we had Jupiter, Moon, Venus, Mercury all in Gemini. So you have to understand, the moon is important because the moon actually has to do with our, like the moon is a planet of fame. It's what we receive often when someone has recognition. You can see it in the moon often. And so the moon was his face, like putting his face on the scandal or whatever you might say. So it's not surprising that the moon goes over that important place in his chart the day that he goes public, which was June 9th, 2013. Now again, since then we had all of these international, this sort of international brouhaha happened where he went from what was it, Hong Kong, then to Russia, and he was in a Russian airport for all this time, and all that stuff happened, and then he finally got asylum in Russia. Meanwhile, world leaders started looking into started questioning the NSA and whatnot, and Barack Obama and the Justice Department and the NSA had to answer for a lot. So the court ruled that it was unconstitutional, the NSA surveillance program, and especially the surveying citizens. This happened on December 16th, 2013. Now, at that time, Saturn had just gone over his natal moon, or it was right on his natal moon, because Saturn is 24 degrees on that day in the sky, and his natal moon is 24 degrees. 24 of Libra, so Saturn is right on his moon. Saturn is on his moon for much of this time, actually, because it's in the same sign. But the day that the court rendered this verdict, Saturn was right on the moon, on his moon, and Jupiter in the sky had just gone retrograde by aspect also, aspecting his natal moon, but retrograde. So Jupiter was at 23 degrees 57 minutes of Gemini, which casts a direct trinal aspect to his natal moon. His natal moon at 24 Libra gets a direct trinal aspect from Jupiter in the sky when I don't know if it's a Supreme Court, I shouldn't say that, but it was a federal court ruled that it was unconstitutional. So again, the court, Jupiter, legal. He became legally validated on some level. They basically legally validated what he had done. It becomes much harder to then treat him as this treasonous criminal when the courts themselves said what he was protesting actually was true. It was not legal. And so it was definitely a boon for him, and made it much harder, much easier for him to be seen as like a martyr rather than just a sort of treasonous criminal. So again, and I actually forgot to mention that the beginning of the disclosure, in June 5th and June 9th, Rahu was also very close to his natal moon. Rahu had just gone over his natal moon. So his natal moon is at 24 degrees, 24:14 of Libra, and Rahu back in June when it happened was at 22:41. So it was barely 1 degree away from his natal moon. So this is the other very important transit. It wasn't just all those planets over his Gemini stellium, his Mars, Rahu, and Gemini, but also Rahu had just gone over his natal moon. Exact degree, pretty much. So by the time, and that was in June, Rahu had just gone over his natal moon. By the time of the court decision, Saturn was on his moon. So again, look at the difference. Rahu goes over his moon, and it's very kind of confusing. He's a foreigner, he's an outcast. I mean, he still is, but Rahu goes over it, and he's a much more confusing figure at that time. We were not knowing what to think of this guy. Who is this guy? Rahu goes over his moon. And then about 6 months later, when Saturn goes right up to his moon, and Jupiter is aspecting, it's like, oh, he's actually a little more legit than we thought. Actually, what he was doing is something that is credible. So this is another way you can see this sort of passage of time. Saturn right on the moon is bringing pressure no matter how you look at it. But especially the Jupiter aspect, it's a retrograde aspect, so it's also reversing something. Reversing sort of public opinion. However, the retrograde of Jupiter also indicates this, the fact that one court said it was unconstitutional and then another court said it was constitutional. So it is a retrograde planet, so we have to be careful about getting too excited about that as far as rendering a verdict on what it says about him. But the other thing that I want to really point out here is the location of the moon on the Supreme Court date, or on the court date of December 16th, and the sun when it first broke, because they're identical. So the sun was at 21 Taurus when the story broke, around there, because the sun moves 21 to 22 Taurus when the story broke, and the moon passed over that exact degree, and about 6.5 months later, when the Supreme Court, or when the court rendered a verdict. So again, this has to do with lunation cycles. The sun was here, and then we had just had, we were basically on the day of the full moon is when this happened, but the sun had just gone into Sagittarius, so it wasn't exactly opposite where the sun was in June, but it was still that opposite sun cycle. So it was the opposite sun cycle as when the story broke. And you can see it evidenced by the fact that the sun was at 21 Taurus when the NSA disclosure happened, and the moon hit that exact same degree when the court rendered a verdict, and the sun in the sky was almost exactly opposite. And in fact, the sun was at 1 degree Sagittarius, which is also exactly opposite where where Jupiter was in the sky, and where Snowden's natal Mars and Rahu is. So the sun is actually opposite that very sensitive point that I just talked about when the court made its decision. And the moon returned to the exact place where the sun was when the story broke. So I want you to, it might sound like a lot. If this is confusing for you, it's because, there's a lot going on here. These are big events, so you're going to see a lot of planets getting triggered. But, I have the charts up here so you can see what I'm talking about. But the reason there's a lot getting triggered is because it shows the magnitude of the event. It was a big event. So you see these exact degrees getting fired off. It's especially interesting how about 6 months later, which again is a whole kind of sun cycle, because you look at where the sun was at 21 Taurus. If you go exactly opposite 21 Taurus, it's 21 Scorpio. Okay? Now, this was later. It wasn't 21 Scorpio because it's not in the same place of the sun cycle. But it's about 10 days later, so instead of 21 Scorpio, it's actually 1 Sagittarius. It's like 10 days after. But it's at the time when the moon has returned to the same point in the sky to where the sun was when the story broke. And Saturn in the sky is exactly on his natal moon, and Jupiter in the sky is exactly trining his natal moon. Which again, this is like exactly the same place where Rahu was back in June. So Rahu was at 22 in June when the story broke. When the court made its decision, Saturn was at 24, and Jupiter was aspecting at 23, that same point where Rahu was, which is like right where his natal moon is. So again, and the moon has to do with our like presence and recognition. This is why he became known on June 9th, when the moon hit that same point in the sky that Jupiter did when the story broke. So it might be a lot to take in, but it's fascinating study in planetary transits and how they trigger things. And again, this would work in pretty much any system, because this is based on the planets in the birth chart and then the planets in the sky by transit. And again, with Vedic astrology, once we see the dasha, like for instance, if I know his birth time, then I would also see the planetary dashas, the cycle that he's in. But even with Western astrology, this is how Western astrology works. That's why these transits are very important. And honestly, most Vedic astrologers leave a lot on the table when it comes to transits and planets in the sky and their movements. This is huge. Every event has to be sanctioned by a transit as well. You will absolutely see what makes an event happen based on where the planets moved, not just the dashas. And sometimes Vedic astrologers especially are way too kind of preoccupied with the dasha, like everything is about the dasha. Of course the dashas are important, but the dashas coordinated with the transits, especially the exact degrees, are very important. Here you see this Jupiter hits an incredibly sensitive point. At the same time, Rahu hits an incredibly sensitive point. And the indications are exactly what are shown. Mars, Rahu, and Gemini sort of destroying, blowing up information and bringing out this whole kind of story that really strengthens our intelligence eventually, because now we all at least know this was happening, and even on a global level. And for a righteous cause, because it was Jupiter that was hitting the trigger. And also Rahu going over his moon, but makes him like this kind of shadowy Rahu figure. And then like 6.5 months later, when Saturn moves up to his moon, he's more established. We kind of know who he is. And Jupiter aspect gives him more legitimacy. Very interesting and fascinating. So let me know what you think of this.